Our immediate former vice president is no longer living at the very lovely, very stately Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. He no longer works in the West Wing. He no longer even lurks in a secure, undisclosed location. No, Dick Cheney now works here. See that sign, the one held to the door by Scotch tape? It says that the office is occupied by the General Services Administration, which sounds like the front name for a top-secret spy agency in a James Bond movie, but in this case it actually indicates, here's Dick Cheney in this little office in the strip mall. In Mr. Cheney's first post-vice presidential interview from this very office with Politico.com, he proved that even from this outside the Beltway, low-rent office park in the Virginia suburbs, he is going to keep sticking to the same themes he perfected while he was in office, which means that it's time for our special series on the post-Bush administration cleanup mission, Scrub, Rinse, Repeat, because this is going to take a while. In his interview with Politico today, Dick Cheney said at least 61 of the prisoners who have been released from Guantanamo have, quote, gone back into the business of being terrorists. That figure, of course, has been roundly debunked, most notably by Seton Hall Law School researchers, who found that that number includes people who have never been in Guantanamo and people whose alleged return to terror consisted of writing op-eds for the New York Times or appearing in documentaries. Undaunted by the truth, the vice president continued with the cockamamie about Guantanamo. Quote, the 200 or so inmates still there, he claimed, are the hardcore, whose recidivism rate would be much higher. Yeah, except that we're still finding out about Guantanamo prisoners who shouldn't be there at all, including, say, Haji Bismillah, who was released last month after being wrongly held for almost 6 years. He said that his brother could vouch for him not being a terrorist. The Bush-Cheney folks said that the brother couldn't be reached. The brother at the time was the chief spokesman for a pro-American governor in Afghanistan. He regularly gave press conferences. Haji Bismillah just out last month after about 6 years. Do we count him as hardcore? But beyond his uncomplicated love of repeating debunked intelligence, the question remains, why is Dick Cheney talking to the press at all, something he hates to do? Why is he doing this barely 2 weeks after leaving office? Well, because even if other former national leaders shut up about their successors, at least for a while after they left office, Dick Cheney can't do that. Because Dick Cheney's work is never done. Because Dick Cheney's job is to remind Americans always that if we don't do what he wants, can we cue the scary lights and sound effects, please? They will slaughter us all!
In some respects, the biggest threat hasn't changed. You get a 9/11 type event where the terrorists are armed with something much more dangerous than an airline ticket and a box cutter. You know, they're equipped with a nuclear weapon or a biological agent of some kind. The potential ability of an Al-Qaeda organization or an Al-Qaeda group to get their hands on that kind of weapon and deploy it in the middle of one of our own cities. That's the ultimate.
Sure. That's the ultimate threat. Do what I say, or it'll be the ultimate threat. Hang on, hang on. They will slaughter us all! Thank you. And just in case that didn't scare the bejesus out of you, how about this next thing?
I think there's a high probability of such an attempt. Whether or not they can pull it off depends whether or not we keep in place policies that have allowed us to defeat all further attempts since 9/11 to launch mass casualty attacks against the United States.
You got that, America? If Dick Cheney's favored policies are not kept 100% totally in place by the new president, you know what will happen. They will slaughter us all! I'm joined now by Glenn Greenwald, a man who really ought to have trademarked some variation of that phrase long ago. Mr. Greenwald is a contributing writer at Salon.com and a former constitutional law attorney. Glenn, thank you for enduring that. It's nice to see you.
My pleasure, Rachel.
You were a much more serious person than that, so
that scared me,
though,
a little bit. So
it was a little scary. Why does it help Dick Cheney politically for him to be scary?
Well, I don't think there's much of a mystery about that. If you look at things that politicians and political scientists, historians have said, even the founders of this country have pointed out many, many times, there's really no more effective weapon for a government to keep a citizenry in submission to whatever it wants than keeping the fear level as high as possible. And that's essentially been the linchpin of the Bush administration for the last 8 years, what you've just been yelling through that megaphone, which is that unless you submit to the powers that we want, you will be attacked by very frightening terrorists. And I think what's so vital to point out is that if you look at American history, the most disgraceful and regrettable acts, the acts that most people consider to be quite awful that we've done in our history, haven't been because we've been insufficiently aggressive about dealing with external threats. It's been the opposite. It's because we've allowed the government to exaggerate external threats and drive us to embrace very radical overreactions, whether it's the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, or the McCarthyite witch hunts of the 1950s, or the censorship laws in the late 18th century, or even at the end of World War I. It's Dick Cheney fear-mongering that has driven us to do the things that we end up regret doing, and it's the responsibility of the citizenry not to let a government do that.
Well, the post-Bush-Cheney legacy polishing, which began during their lame duck period, says that these measures that they took, even if some people found them distasteful or even if they had some unpleasant side effects, they were all done for the right reason. They were all done to keep us safe. And Dick Cheney is still making that case now, even just 2 weeks out of office. Does that need to be taken apart?
Well, a couple things about that. One is, you know, if you look at the argument that Cheney made throughout this interview, and it's the one that not only supporters of his make, but also people in the media, I think, have largely come to accept, which is that, well, there must be something to what they did because, after all, they kept us safe ever since the September 11th attacks. If you really think about what that argument is, how inane it is becomes so readily apparent. What they're really saying is, during our administration, we allowed one catastrophic terrorist attack on U.S. soil, but don't worry because we only allowed one, and we didn't allow any after that. And the implication of this is that somehow before Dick Cheney and George Bush and their torture camps and waterboarding and invasions of other countries arrived on the scene, it's as though they are implying that the United States was regularly attacked catastrophically by foreign terrorists, that we had terrorist attacks every several months, and until Dick Cheney got into place, now we only have one every 8 years. And what's so important to remember is, back in 1993, in January of 1993, the second or third week of Bill Clinton's presidency, the World Trade Center was attacked by Islamic radicals, and Bill Clinton didn't open Guantanamo. He didn't disappear people to secret camps. He didn't go around touting and beating his chest about how important it was that we torture. And yet, for the next 8 years of the Clinton presidency, to use the jargon, he kept us safe. There were no other foreign terrorist attacks. And by this rationale, that would mean that Clinton's approach of law enforcement, of prosecuting terrorists in federal courts, that is what actually keeps us safe. And I think that's the twisted logic that's constantly invoked.
But this argument is setting us up for the future, and you wrote about this at Salon.com today, that if something does happen, if there is another attack, there's a reason to keep pushing this legacy, to keep pushing this idea about what Bush and Cheney did, so that there will be a political blowback against Barack Obama. So if something, God forbid, ever did happen again, the country wouldn't rally around him the way they rallied around Bush and Cheney at 9/11, but rather they would turn against him.
Yeah, that's what's so nefarious, is it's setting the groundwork so that if there's another terrorist attack, and everyone agrees that there's a high likelihood that at some point, no matter what our policies are, there will be, unless we turn ourselves into a complete police state. There's no way to completely prevent any risk, including one of a terrorist attack. But I think what's so critical to consider is that after the 9/11 attacks, the question that so many Americans were asking with this sort of bewilderment is, why do they hate us? That was the question that everyone was asking. And I think in order to get the answer, you should go read the interview that Dick Cheney gave today from the Politico, because the things he's saying are things like, and this is a quote, we need to be dirty, nasty, and mean in our foreign policy. We need to launch wars in order to keep people respectful of who we are. And what I think all experts, counterterrorism experts, agree is that things like torturing people and putting them into secret camps and invading other countries and dropping bombs on wedding parties and villages, those things don't stop terrorism. Those are the things that fuel terrorism, that cause and enable it. And that's why you've seen Al-Qaeda strengthen over the last 8 years and terrorism increasing. It's because of those policies that he's defending.
Glenn Greenwald, Salon.com. Great to have you on the show. Thanks, Glenn.
Great to be here, Rachel.
About 75%.